I always thought betrayal was something I'd never be capable of. But there I was, staring into the eyes of my husband's best friend, Lucas, as he whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you." My heart raced, torn between guilt and a thrill I couldn't explain. I should have walked away, but I didn't. And that decision changed everything: my marriage, my life, and the person I thought I was. My husband, Ethan, and I had been married for 8 years. 8 long years filled with ups and downs, but mostly routine. Ethan was a good man, kind, hardworking, and reliable. He wasn't the type to forget anniversaries or neglect me, but over time, something between us had shifted. The spark we once shared had dimmed, replaced by the monotony of daily life. Conversations became brief exchanges, affection turned into habit, and intimacy felt like a distant memory. I tried to tell myself this was normal, that all couples go through phases like this. But as days turned into months, the loneliness began to weigh on me. I missed the way he used to look at me, the way he'd make me feel like the most important person in the world. I convinced myself that focusing on our responsibilities, work, bills, and keeping the house running would fix things. It didn't. Lucas had always been part of our lives. He and Ethan had been best friends since college, and he was practically family. Lucas was everything Ethan wasn't: charismatic, adventurous, and effortlessly charming. He had a knack for lighting up any room he walked into, his easy smile and sharp wit drawing people in. I never thought much of him beyond being my husband's friend. Until one day, I did. It started innocently enough: a few shared jokes at a barbecue, a compliment about a dress I'd worn, a lingering glance across the room. At first, I brushed it off. After all, what harm could a little harmless banter do? But something about the way Lucas spoke to me, the way he saw me, felt different. It felt real. One Saturday afternoon, while Ethan was running errands, Lucas stopped by to return some tools he'd borrowed. I invited him in for a quick chat, thinking nothing of it. But as we sat on the couch, laughing about old stories, I realized he was looking at me, not just glancing, but truly seeing me. When he complimented my laugh, it was like hearing something I hadn't in years. That moment awakened something inside me, something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. After that Saturday, I found myself thinking about Lucas more often than I should have. His words replayed in my mind, his laugh echoing in my ears. I told myself it was harmless, just a fleeting distraction from the dullness of my daily life. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more persistent they became. It was as if a door had been opened, and I couldn't shut it. Every time Lucas came around, my heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. I started noticing little things about him: the way his smile lingered when he looked at me, the subtle warmth in his tone when he spoke my name. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things out of desperation. But then the signs became harder to ignore. At a small dinner party we hosted, Lucas sat across from me. The room was full of laughter and conversation, but all I could feel was his gaze on me. When I finally glanced up, his eyes met mine, and it wasn't a casual look: it was deep, lingering, and filled with something unspoken. My cheeks burned, and I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the conversation. But I could feel it, the pull between us growing stronger with each passing moment. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I stayed up cleaning the kitchen. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the way Lucas made me feel. My phone buzzed on the counter, and my stomach dropped when I saw his name. His message was simple: "You looked amazing tonight." I couldn't stop staring. My fingers hovered over the screen as guilt and excitement collided within me. I knew I should ignore it, delete the message, and pretend it never happened. But instead, I typed back, "Don't say things like that." I told myself it was a warning, a way to draw a line, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I didn't want him to stop. From that moment on, every interaction with Lucas felt charged. A casual touch on my arm lingered a second too long. His jokes, once innocent, carried a double meaning. And every time he looked at me, it was as though he was daring me to admit what we both knew was happening. I couldn't deny it anymore: there was something between us, something neither of us had asked for but couldn't seem to avoid. One evening, Ethan left town for a work trip, and Lucas offered to help me with some minor repairs around the house. I should have said no. I should have known better. But instead, I said yes. As he stood in my kitchen, fixing a leaky faucet, the tension between us was almost unbearable. When he finished, he leaned against the counter, his eyes locking onto mine. I can't stop thinking about you, he said, his voice low and steady. My heart stopped. Lucas, this is wrong. We can't, I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. I know, he said, stepping closer, but that doesn't change how I feel. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end whatever this was before it spiraled out of control. But when he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, I froze. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, and in that moment, all the guilt, all the fear melted away, leaving only the raw intensity of what we were feeling. This isn't fair, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's not, he agreed, his eyes searching mine. But can you honestly say you don't feel it too? I couldn't answer. The truth was, I did. And as he leaned in, closing the space between us, I knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. The kiss was brief, hesitant, as if testing the waters of a storm we were about to dive into. But it was enough to shatter the fragile boundary I'd been clinging to. Lucas pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine for regret or hesitation. I should have pushed him away, should have told him to leave and never come back. But instead, I found myself reaching for him, my fingers brushing against his. Lucas, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This isn't right. No, he said softly, stepping closer. But it feels real. I couldn't argue with him. The way his touch sent electricity through me, the way his presence made me feel alive again, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt seen, wanted. My heart raced as he placed a hand gently on my waist, his thumb grazing my hip in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. We can't do this, I said, though my words carried no conviction. If Ethan ever found out. He won't, Lucas interrupted, his voice steady. This is just us. Right here, right now. His words hung in the air, heavy with temptation. I wanted to resist, to remind myself of the life I'd built with Ethan. But when Lucas leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine with a mix of urgency and restraint, I couldn't pull away. The room seemed to fade around us, leaving only the sound of my own racing heartbeat and the feeling of his hands on me. As the night unfolded, the boundaries between right and wrong blurred further. We sat on the couch, our conversation interspersed with stolen glances and accidental touches that no longer felt accidental. Lucas leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. You deserve to feel wanted, Laura, he said, his words hitting me like a tidal wave. You deserve to be seen. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I looked at him. He was saying the words I hadn't even admitted to myself, voicing the ache I'd buried for so long. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand, my fingers intertwining with his. This is dangerous, I murmured, my voice trembling. I know, he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. But tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll walk away right now. I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, silenced by the weight of my own desires. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my forehead against his as I closed my eyes. The space between us disappeared, and suddenly, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the guilt, only the connection we were sharing in that moment. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Every touch, every whispered word, every lingering glance felt like crossing another line. Lucas was gentle yet insistent, his presence overwhelming in a way that left me breathless. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to let someone else see the parts of me I'd hidden for so long. When the night finally ended, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment in my mind. The weight of what I'd done pressed heavily on my chest, but so did something else, something I hadn't felt in years. A spark of life, a sense of excitement and connection that I thought had been lost forever. The days that followed were filled with stolen moments and secret exchanges. Lucas and I found excuses to see each other, quick coffee meetings, brief encounters at the park, even late-night phone calls where we whispered to each other like teenagers. Each interaction fed the fire we'd ignited, making it harder and harder to stop. But with each step deeper into our affair, the guilt grew stronger. Every time Ethan smiled at me or kissed my forehead, I felt a pang of shame that cut deeper than I thought possible. I tried to convince myself that what Lucas and I were sharing didn't diminish the love I had for my husband, but I knew it wasn't true. I was living a double life, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. One evening, as Lucas and I sat together in his car parked in a secluded lot, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "This can't go on like this, Laura," he said. "I need more." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep sneaking around, pretending this is enough," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "I need to know where we stand. I need to know if this is real for you." His words hung in the air, forcing me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just a fleeting affair anymore, it was something more. And as I looked into Lucas's eyes, I realized I had a choice to make. The intensity between Lucas and me had reached its peak. Every stolen moment, every whispered promise had tied us closer together. Yet, with each passing day, the weight of what I was doing became harder to ignore. It felt as if I were balancing on the edge of a knife, one wrong step, and everything would come crashing down. One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, I met Lucas at the small park where this all began. We sat on a secluded bench, shielded by the trees, as if hiding our guilt from the world. Lucas reached for my hand, his grip warm and firm. "We can't keep going like this, Laura," he said, his voice tinged with both frustration and longing. "I need to know what you want." I stared at him, my mind racing. What did I want? The life I'd built with Ethan, safe and steady, or the thrill and passion I'd found with Lucas? The question had haunted me for weeks, but now, sitting there with Lucas, I knew I couldn't delay the decision any longer. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Startled, I pulled it out and saw Ethan's name on the screen. My heart sank as I realized the time I had promised him I'd be home to help with dinner. I turned to Lucas, my chest tightening with guilt. "I have to go," I said, standing abruptly. "Laura," Lucas called after me, his tone urgent. "You can't keep running from this. From us." His words stayed with me as I walked away, my thoughts a jumbled mess of emotions. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was wrong. Ethan was standing in the living room, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. My stomach churned as I set my bag down, trying to appear composed. "What's going on?" Ethan pulled out his phone and handed it to me. My blood ran cold as I saw the screen, a thread of text messages between Lucas and me. Messages I thought I had deleted. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with anger. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My mind scrambled for an excuse, a way to undo what had been exposed, but the look in Ethan's eyes told me it was too late. He already knew. "I trusted you," he said, his voice breaking. I trusted him. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain. "It wasn't what it looks like, Ethan, I swear." "Don't," he interrupted sharply, his tone colder than I'd ever heard it. "Don't insult me by lying." At that moment, the walls I'd built around my secret came crashing down. I confessed everything, the late-night texts, the stolen moments, the kiss that changed everything. I told him it hadn't gone further, but I could see in his eyes that it didn't matter. The betrayal was enough. Ethan sat silently for a moment, his face pale and his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet pain that cut deeper than any yell could have. "Why?" he asked simply. I tried to explain the loneliness, the disconnection, the way Lucas made me feel alive again. But every word sounded hollow, even to my own ears. How could I justify hurting the man who had stood by me for 8 years? Ethan stood abruptly, grabbing his keys from the counter. "I need some time," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't call me." As the door slammed shut behind him, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a tidal wave. I collapsed onto the couch, my sobs echoing through the empty house. The life I had built, the man I had vowed to love and cherish, was slipping through my fingers, and I had no one to blame but myself. The next few days were a blur of silence and regret. Ethan didn't come home, and I couldn't bring myself to reach out to him. Lucas called once, but I ignored it. I knew I couldn't keep running to him, not if I wanted any chance of saving my marriage. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Ethan returned home one evening, his expression calm but his eyes cold. He handed me a small stack of papers, separation documents. My heart sank as I realized he wasn't just angry, he was done. "I can't do this anymore, Laura," he said, his voice void of emotion. "I can't look at you without thinking about what you did. Ethan, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I made a mistake. I'll do anything to fix this." But he shook his head. "Some things can't be fixed." As I watched him pack a bag and walk out the door, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. The life I had taken for granted was gone, shattered by my own choices. I wanted to blame Lucas, to tell myself he had manipulated me, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had let it happen. I had crossed the line. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I sought therapy, hoping to understand why I had made the choices I did. I reached out to Ethan, apologizing again and again, but his responses were brief and distant. I knew he needed time, but I couldn't help but wonder if time would ever be enough. As for Lucas, he faded from my life as quickly as he had entered it. I deleted his number, blocked him on social media, and avoided the places I knew he frequented. I needed to let go of the past if I had any hope of moving forward. The guilt still lingers, a constant reminder of the consequences of my actions. I've learned the hard way that secrets never stay buried, and betrayal always leaves scars. Whether my marriage survives or not, I know I'll carry this with me for the rest of my life. And as I sit alone in the house we once shared, I can't help but wonder, was it worth it? The answer, of course, is no. It never is. The days following Ethan's departure felt like a slow-motion car crash. Each moment dragged on, filled with regret, loneliness, and a heavy silence that seemed to echo through the empty house. I hadn't realized how much I relied on Ethan's presence until it was gone, his steady voice, his comforting touch, the way he made the house feel like a home. Now, it was just me and the weight of my choices. Ethan and I hadn't spoken since the night he handed me the separation papers. I stared at them every day, unable to bring myself to sign them. I couldn't accept that this was how our story would end. But no matter how much I wanted to fix things, I knew it wasn't entirely up to me. Ethan needed space, and all I could do was wait and hope that he might find it in his heart to forgive me. Meanwhile, Lucas became a ghost of my past, haunting my thoughts but absent from my life. He had tried to reach out a few times, sending apologetic texts and leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. I deleted his messages without reading them, knowing that keeping him in my life would only make things worse. I told myself it was for the best, that cutting him off was the first step toward rebuilding the life I had shattered. But the truth was, I still thought about him. Not because I wanted him, but because he represented everything I had let myself lose control over: the loneliness, the desperation, the craving for something I couldn't even name. I hated myself for it, for letting those feelings consume me and destroy the life Ethan and I had built. One evening, I found myself sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in my hand and the separation papers spread out on the coffee table. I picked up the pen and hovered over the dotted line, my heart pounding. Signing those papers felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I had thrown away my marriage for a fleeting moment of passion. I set the pen down, unable to do it. Instead, I called Ethan. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail, but I left a message anyway. "Ethan, it's me. I know you don't want to talk, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you'll give me a chance to show you that I can do better. That we can be better." I hung up, my hands shaking. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do. The rest was up to him. The following week was a roller coaster of emotions. Some days, I felt a glimmer of hope that Ethan might respond, that we could start to rebuild what was broken. Other days, I was consumed by guilt and shame, replaying every moment that had led to this point. I threw myself into therapy, determined to understand why I had made the choices I did and how I could prevent myself from making them again. Then, one evening, Ethan showed up at the house. I hadn't expected him, and when I opened the door to see him standing there, my heart felt like it might burst. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm but guarded. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, the tension between us palpable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his hands clasped tightly together. "About us. About everything that happened." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "I'm not sure I can trust you again," he continued, his voice heavy with pain. "But I also can't pretend that I don't still care about you. That I don't want to try." Tears welled in my eyes as I listened to his words. "Ethan, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I just want a chance to fix what I broke." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I don't know if this will work," he said. "But I'm willing to try. For now." Relief washed over me, but I knew this was just the beginning. Rebuilding our relationship would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But I was willing to do whatever it took. I owed him that much and more. As for Lucas, I never saw him again. Whatever connection we'd shared had burned out as quickly as it had ignited, leaving only ashes in its wake. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and made a promise to myself never to let loneliness drive me to such a dark place again. Ethan and I began attending couples therapy, slowly untangling the web of emotions and betrayals that had brought us to this point. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of what I had done felt unbearable. But each time Ethan chose to stay, to work through the pain with me, I felt a glimmer of hope. The fallout of my choices had left scars on both of us, but I hoped that with time, those scars could become reminders of how far we had come and how much we still had to fight for. Months passed, and though life slowly began to regain some semblance of normalcy, nothing truly felt the same. Ethan and I continued attending couples therapy, unpacking the hurt and mistrust that had settled between us like an unwelcome guest. Every session was a step forward, but it was also a reminder of the damage I had caused. I knew this process would be long and painful, but I was determined to see it through, for him, for us, and for myself. There were days when I could feel the weight of Ethan's hesitation, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes or how his touch felt guarded, unsure. And I couldn't blame him. Trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. But he stayed, and that gave me hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the chance to rebuild. I also continued my individual therapy, desperate to understand the why behind my actions. What had driven me to seek validation outside my marriage? Why had I allowed myself to fall into something I knew would destroy everything I loved? The answers weren't simple, but they were necessary. I came to realize that the loneliness I had felt wasn't entirely Ethan's fault. Yes, our relationship had grown distant, but I had been just as complicit in that drift. I had chosen to bury my feelings instead of addressing them. I had chosen silence when I should have sought connection. And when an opportunity for attention presented itself, I had chosen to indulge in it rather than fight for what I already had. The guilt lingered, a constant reminder of the betrayal I had committed. But alongside that guilt came a sense of determination, a commitment to never let myself fall into such a destructive pattern again. I made a promise to Ethan and to myself that I would communicate better, that I would work harder to nurture our marriage rather than look elsewhere for what I felt was missing. As for Lucas, he remained a chapter one would never revisit. What I had once seen as passion and connection now felt like a cruel mirage, something that had only served to highlight the cracks in my own character. He was a reminder of my darkest moments, a lesson I would carry with me but never repeat. Ethan and I started to rebuild, one small step at a time. We made time for each other again, cooking dinner together, taking walks in the evening, even sitting down to simply talk about our day. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. Slowly, the laughter returned, the shared moments that reminded us of why we had chosen each other in the first place. In the quiet moments, I reflected on everything that had happened, the choices I had made, the pain I had caused, and the lessons I had learned. I realized that infidelity isn't just about the act itself, it's about the cracks in the foundation that allow it to happen. It's about the silent erosion of trust, communication, and connection. If there was one thing I had learned, it was this: relationships take work. They require vulnerability, honesty, and effort, even when it feels easier to drift apart. And while betrayal can destroy, it doesn't always have to. With enough love, patience, and commitment, it's possible to rebuild, though the scars may never fully fade. Now, as I look at Ethan, I see a man who chose to give me another chance, even when he didn't have to. And that is a gift I will never take for granted again. Our story isn't the same as it once was, but it's still ours. And for that, I am grateful. If you've ever faced a moment of weakness or regret, you know how hard it is to rebuild what's been broken. What would you have done in my place? Could you have forgiven someone like me? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that dig into the raw and real complexities of love and betrayal.